Sorry.
No, you're fine. So just quick overview of the Gardner Policy Institute. We're under the David Eccles School of Business, and we have three main areas, economics, demographics, and that's the team I'm on. I work for Pam Perlick, if you guys have gotten to interact with her at all. And then survey research, so if we can ever be of assistance. And then the State Data Center program is a partnership with the Census Bureau. And so if you ever want to dig around and you're having trouble with Census Bureau programs or products, feel free to email me or call, and I will do my best to try to help you out. So I'm a resource to you and anyone else who has questions. So just to kind of give a high level overview of this presentation, Utah is a place that grows. It's always grown, and our Latino population has played a significant role in that. The population, the Latino population, is the second largest group, racial ethnic group in the state, and that's just using the federal Office of Management and Budget guidelines. So there's 5 race groups, and then ethnicity is Hispanic or Latino. So just with the federal data, that's kind of how it works.
What is the largest? You said it's the second. What's the largest?
Non-Hispanic white.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So the non-Hispanic white is like 77, 78%. And then Hispanic or Latino is now around 14%. And I'll get into that a little more in just a minute. And then I provided a couple other insights out of just basic demographics. Through. There we go. So we just got our first census number, which is our apportionment number and our total population for the state. And with that number, we learned that we were the fastest growing state throughout the decade. So we actually had seen that for the past couple of years. So this isn't a big surprise or anything, but we got a shout out in the national press. So that was pretty exciting. We didn't get an additional seat, no congressional changes, just in case you weren't sitting here watching your computer all day on the 26th like I was. And our growth has accelerated in recent decades. So the 1990s, we saw some changes in how our state grows. The stars kind of indicate those million markers. So we hit, my star's a little bit off, but our first million was in 1966. Our second million was 1995. And then we hit 3 million in 2015. So those time frames kind of shrunk. We went for a long time as a small Western state out here, and have grown significantly. I'll also throw out, I'm going to send this presentation to Ed afterwards, so you guys can all have a copy if you want it. You don't have to. But one thing that I wanted to look at is, because our growth rate was 18.4% throughout the decade statewide, what that looked like for the Latino population. And these are two different ways. Right? So one is the decade growth. So just kind of comparing the first part of the decade to the end of the decade, and then kind of the average annual growth. And the Latina population has had some pretty significant jumps and changes in growth, and it's been higher than the total population. And you can see in the 90s, it's another hint of kind of what I mentioned before, but we had some changing dynamics. We had a lot of migration that I'll talk about a little bit more. But there was pretty intense growth for the Latino population in the 90s, and then it's kind of gone down since then. But even in the past decade, and this is using the population estimates, so these numbers might change a little bit when we get the redistricting data in August, but still higher, even though it's come down this decade, it's still higher than what's going on in the total population. So we ended the decade. This is again an estimate. So this is a 2019 estimate, and we're going to get the official number from the census in August of the full population, the race and ethnicity breakouts. But the estimates from the Census Bureau showed about over 462,000 people identifying as Latino or Hispanic. And that has just kind of increased over time. Obviously, with those growth rates, you would expect to see an increase. And and the gray bar is the Latina population, and then what it makes up of the whole population. Our population in the state is around 3.3 million, according to the census number now. And then throughout the decade, about 23.5% of our total statewide growth has been due to growth in the Latino population. This chart kind of just shows the total of each of the major categories that the Office of Management and Budget uses, and then their contributions to our statewide growth. And then that made me curious about previous decades. And so you can see that, again, the 90s, 2000s had some pretty significant growth, and we're kind of around that, the share from the 90s. Oh, I wanted to throw in one other thing. I forgot to look down at my notes. Of the whole population, so if we go back here, there's a higher share of the Latino or Latina population living along the Wasatch Front than the population as a whole. So if you look at Salt Lake, Davis, Utah, and Weber counties, that accounts for 75% of our total population statewide. But for the Latina population, it's around 82%. And 47% of the Latina population lives in Salt Lake County, which is higher than the statewide share, which is around 36% of the population lives in Salt Lake County.
I have a question, Mallory.
Yeah.
So does this include immigrants as well, these numbers? Yes, okay.
Yeah. And all of this is self-identification too. I'll throw that out, or based on self-identification. So these population estimates are based on the decennial census information, but the decennial census and American Community Survey are all dependent on how people self-identify. So
thank you.
Yeah, if people aren't checking the box, then we don't know, at least within the census data. I had one other note on this, that 52% using those estimates, 52% of the national growth in population was from the Latina population. And that was, Pew did some analysis of the population estimates. Pew has a really great body of research, and they're constantly running surveys. If you want a little bit more national insight, they don't always get down to the state level, but they provide a lot of great research, and they're constantly updating, so it's a great resource. This is just using those same population estimates and showing that, whoops, sorry about that. The annual growth, so the non-Hispanic white is the red line on that chart, and you can see the growth is kind of hovering between 1 and 1.5% throughout the decade. And then the minority, so all the other populations that aren't non-Hispanic white, had a different growth rate. So we've got 2.5% up to almost 4%. And then the pie chart is just showing our statewide racial and ethnic composition. And as I mentioned before, we're about 78% non-Hispanic white. The groupings on the right are all these groups as non-Hispanic and alone. So we have the group of 2 or more races, because people, identify as more than one thing. And 2 or more is actually one of our faster growing groups. We just put out at Gardner a book with some data about race, ethnicity, and gender. And I found that around 60% or 2/3, depending on which data source we're pulling from, of the Hispanic or Latino population identifies as white. And then most of the rest of everybody identifies as either some other race or 2 or more races. So the whole social construct of race is pretty complicated, and it was an interesting exercise to explain that to people. But just so you have some context of, I don't know, how these federal breaks look. So this chart is just showing that migration has become a more consistent component of change, and the migration is the gray shaded area. Natural increase, so births minus deaths is the red dotted line. And then population change, the total change, is the black line. And so, you know, we've been a state that has grown since since we were a territory. We got counted as a territory prior to becoming a state. Our population has always grown, but it's been a lot on births. You know, we're a young state, we're the youngest state in the nation. And so the shift to migration in recent decades has also kind of reflected a different economy. We're more diverse than we used to be, and a more attractive place, I think, for people to move than we had been in the past. So Pam and a colleague, Mike Hollingshouse on the team, a couple years ago modeled what our population would look like if we didn't have that migration, especially in the 90s. So the people moving here and then staying here and having kids, and then their kids staying here, having kids. And you can see the gray area is if we would have just kind of kept on the status quo from prior to 1990. And we wouldn't have hit 3 million people until 2031. And then that red area is the estimates. So estimates are up to now and then projections looking forward. But you can see that the people that have moved here and stayed here, made a house, had a family, they've made a significant impact on our population growth over the past 2 or 3 decades. I wanted to pull this in here to look at total fertility rates for each population, because there was a paper put out by the CDC a couple of years ago looking at the non-Hispanic white total fertility rate, Hispanic or Latina fertility rate, and then Black. And there are some pretty interesting differences across these. So total fertility rate reflects the total number of children a woman could expect to have in her lifetime in this year. And we've seen our statewide number go down over the past 4 years. We used to be #1 always. And then North Dakota and South Dakota kind of snuck in as our fertility rate came down. And you can see, so the bluer shades are higher values, the more green shades are lower values. The non-Hispanic white women are still high. They're the highest. This was our last year, is the highest fertility rate. But that was at 2.099. And then the Hispanic or Latina total fertility rate was 2.324. And so that ended up bumping us up to over 2.1, which is replacement rate. Now we're down to 1.985. And part of that, from conversations with Pam and Mike, who look at this kind of stuff a lot in detail, is, people that moved here in the 90s might have been younger. They might have been more first generation people moving here. And the first generation immigrants typically have higher birth rates, and then things kind of start to normalize and fertility rates come down a little bit. And so we kind of think that's impacting why we stayed high for a couple extra years and why we're kind of coming down now. And then just to give this a little bit of other framing, in 2019, the Latina population, there were 8,139 births to Latina mothers in Utah, and then 33,000 to non-Hispanic white. So it's still, reflective of the population. We still have a lot of babies, but just another kind of contextual point. And those fertility rates and births and younger populations kind of get reflected in a lot of different ways. I just did a paper looking at households, and this was another kind of consideration, that household sizes were a little bit larger for the Hispanic or Latino population than the non-Hispanic white population. And family sizes were quite a bit larger. And then on the right, you can see median age, and I threw in the total for Utah and the United States, just so you can see. So kind of those darker shades, the bright red and the darker gray, are Utah. And we're so much younger than the nation, but part of that is, our 14% of the population, the median age is around 25, compared to 29.8, almost 30 nationwide for the Latino population. So it's an important, just I think in planning services and planning events and stuff, we've got a young population here that's reflected both in our total population and in the Latina population. And I threw this together this morning, so hopefully it's not too funky. But using those population estimates, I wanted to look at the generations. And this is using the Pew guidelines for generations. But you can see that younger population reflected here as well, with a higher share of the Latino population being Gen Z, or those youngest, the youngest population. That chunk is probably too big. I bet they're going to cut it down at some point because things change so quickly that a big 20-year window is going to get refined soon. And then a slightly higher share of millennials, and then lower shares of the older population. So boomers, and then the silent and greatest generations are slightly lower shares of the Latino population compared to the total population. And now this is another thing, kind of looking back at the immigration, our foreign population has changed since the 90s. So that chart, the bar chart with the line on it, shows the foreign-born population as a share of our population. And then the red line shows the value in thousands. So we're at about 275,000 people in Utah having foreign-born, were born elsewhere. And then looking at the regions of birth, that has changed quite a bit. The bar charts over on the other side of the screen look before, so the top is entered the US before 2000, and the gray is the Hispanic or Latino population. The red is the Asian population. The middle is 2000 to 2009, and then 2010 or later. And you know, there's a lot of factors that have gone into this. There's a lot of policy that I don't get to comment on under the hat that I'm wearing now, but you know, we've seen some changes in who's moving to Utah from outside of the US, and a decreasing share in recent years of those born in Latin America. So we can get some insights into where people are from. And I apologize, I condensed this down from the full list just because I couldn't figure out how to make everything fit. But most of our Latino or Latino population in Utah identifies as Mexican. And that's actually increased since 2000. So we're up to around 74% now. And then the other large groups are other Hispanic or Latino, and I need to read the code book because the options were Spaniard, Spanish, or other Hispanic or Latino. And so I guess if you're not identifying with a Central American country or South American country, or, you know, Puerto Rico, Cuba, or the Dominican, like, I guess you're falling in there. I'm not familiar with all the other groups that would fall under other Hispanic or Latino, but I'm happy to look into it if that's of interest. And then looking at South American and Central American, I just pulled out the groups that had the largest populations. So for Central America, the Guatemalan and Salvadoran populations, I think were estimated around 10,000 people, 10 or 11,000. And then for South America, the Peruvian, Colombian, and Venezuelan populations were kind of around 8,000 to 9,000. And those are coming from the American Community Survey. It is a sample-based survey, so there are margins of error there. But those groups are large enough. I mean, it could be you add 800 people or you subtract 800 people, but those are still the groups that stood out in these regional analysis. Wanted to grab educational attainment for you. This is looking at the population over age 25. So hopefully if you're following the old, you know, you go through everything, you're likely maybe done with most of school by 25. So that kind of evens out some of the the issues with a younger population. And so you can see the Latino or Latino population has a little bit lower shares, a lot lower shares of graduate or bachelor's degree, and then higher shares of high school graduates, and then those with less education. I wanted to dig into this and do a little bit of a time series, but I just ran out of time to do that. But if that would be of interest or helpful to you guys at all, let me know, and I can have an excuse to dig into this more. But I would bet this has changed a bit, quite a bit over time. And then I pulled some occupations. So there's a lot of words, I'm sorry. This is another one. There's a lot of categories. I couldn't figure out the easiest way to represent it on screen. But looking at these are, so if the working age population, this is looking 16 and older in this table. I looked at, these are the groups that had 14% or higher. So overrepresentation of the Latino or Latina population in these occupations. And you can see there, the industries or occupations are in service, healthcare support, food prep, custodial and maintenance, and then natural resources. This is a long table with lots of kind of subheaders, and I'm happy to send you the link to this if this is of interest, because it's a little easier to navigate when you can see the whole list. And then production, transportation, and moving are the three. So service, natural resources, construction, and production transportation were the three main headers that had higher shares of the Latino or Latina population represented. And then on the other side, we have things like management and business, science, and arts. And this one has several subheaders. So that's one whole chunk over there. Kind of highlighting different, STEM fields or education, legal. And then looking at the other side, we have more health and then sales and office. One thing to consider here, I don't have the margins of error. And so closer look at that. This was all kind of back of the envelope, quick calculation. It might be worth looking at that. And some of these that are close or are really low, the margin of error might kind of change what the story shows a little bit.
Mallory, I have a question.
Yeah.
So I did not see on there, unless I missed something, is farm work, because I understand that's a significant portion of the Latino population in Utah. Did I miss something, or is it on there, or was it not? I see farming, but I'm not sure if that's the same as the farm worker.
I'm gonna guess that's covering some of it. There are industry tables. So one fun note with a lot of the economic data, this is coming from the American Community Survey, so it's a little bit different, but a lot of the economic data doesn't get into race and ethnicity very frequently because that's not the structure it was set up to be collected in. So I'll look into that a little more. I would bet that it is that farming, fishing, and forestry. And I think maybe due to the sample size, things got kind of condensed into those more aggregated groups. But I can look into that a little more and send Ed a note with what I see, and I'll send you guys the table as well so you can look at it on your own.
Thank you.
That's my understanding, Mallory, that is part of that farming, fishing, and forestry occupations. And I work with some of the census data as well, and I have in the past. And what I'm seeing too is this is reflective of the educational achievement as well. We see like the higher proportions in occupations that don't require as much education. And that's where Latinos are disproportionately overrepresented. And then they're disproportionately underrepresented in occupations that do require more education. That's kind of what I'm seeing. Yeah,
I think that's true. And I'll also throw out with the decennial census and the American Community Survey, everything's dependent on an address. So if people that are like working on a farm have some kind of unusual housing situation that maybe doesn't have a mailing address, and whoever the boss is didn't send in some kind of information providing like we've got a bunch of people living here and working here, there could be a little bit of discrepancy in the responses we see. I'm not super familiar with, how farming works, but I know that was a concern with the decennial census, is that some communities might not show up because housing might be a slightly non-traditional style. And then I grabbed this one. I don't typically work with this, but it just came out, so I thought I would kind of poke around with it. This uses the current population survey, and the sample sizes there are typically a bit smaller, so that's part of why we don't use it as much. But this is looking at the 2020 election and participation. And you can see, I tried, hopefully this isn't too much of a mess. There was a lot I was trying to put onto one chart, but comparing the US and Utah with the Hispanic or Latino population, the total population is in the middle for some reason. And then the white non-Hispanic alone, because that's our largest population group, and just kind of comparing. This is looking at registered citizens as a share of the population. And so I think this is where I would turn to Pew and look at their papers on, they've got a lot on the election, they've got a lot on political participation, and they can give a much broader and more in-depth commentary than I would be able to. But just know that there is data available if you want to look into this. There were a couple other factors you could look at in this table. So that's a resource that's out there that's that just came out in the past couple of weeks. And then I'll just end with this. Our population, we're working on our population projections right now. They're going to come out at the end of the year, but we don't anticipate Utah to stop growing. And in that continued growth, we anticipate continued racial and ethnic diversification, because our younger populations are more racially and ethnically diverse than our older populations. So if those kids stay in Utah, if they make their homes, if they start families, this is all gonna keep growing over time as a share. And so I just wanted to kind of end with this and be, I think there's a lot of room for more data. Hopefully, as our sample size grows, we can gain more and more insights into the population. And we'll be revisiting this, I think, in a couple years. This was done a year or two ago, but once we have our new baseline for the projections, I think we'll revisit this and see if we see anything new. And with that, I'll just kind of wrap up. My contact information is here. As I mentioned, I'll send Ed the slides. I also threw in a list with links of the reports that I mentioned or utilized. I will throw out one other note that with the Census Bureau data, Hispanic or Latino showed up in the 1970 census. And then prior to that, in 1930, the 1930 census, people were asked if they were Mexican. And so there's kind of a gap in the Census Bureau data. That Pam talks about that in that Utah Minorities, the story told by 150 years of census data. But if you ever need aggregate numbers, that report is the spot to go. And we're gonna hopefully add some new updates when we have the new data. But if anyone has any other questions, let me know. If not, feel free to contact me if I can be of any assistance. And yeah, thanks for sharing some of your morning with me.
Mallory, this is Maria. I do have a question for you. Can you just mention the diversity data report that was released on Thursday a little bit to introduce it to this group? And I can talk a little bit more about it because I'm on the Multicultural Commission, but the data was quite
I'll stop sharing really fast so I can see you guys. So we put together a data book, and I will let you provide more commentary because I get to stick to the data. But we were asked to put together a data book providing some insights into what our state looks like now. So we provide some basic demographic data looking at the racial and ethnic composition of the state. And then we look at the different populations in regards to economics, education, health, and housing. And I think those are the main main topics. But it's a new resource. We haven't had something like this at the state level before. And it was quite an undertaking. I'll say it was a growing and learning experience over at the Gardner Institute. I think some people were surprised at all kinds of things. So if that's of use, let us know. Also, I'll if you have any additional notes, Maria, please jump in. But I'll also say if there's anything that would be of interest that's going to come out of the 2020 data, we're working on trying to put together products that are going to make sense for people and be useful for people. The decennial is limited. It's a short questionnaire. It's like 10 questions. But if you have any ideas of things you would like to know about out of the decennial data, feel free to shoot me an email, because we want to make sure the products that we create are useful for people. So I'll just throw that out there as well.
Okay, I have a question, Mallory.
Yeah.
So in my book, I indicated that the Latino population in Utah in 2050, 1 of every 3 Utahns will be Latino. And I believe I got that from Pam. So any feedback on that? Any, how accurate is that? Any projections?
Let me pull up I'll put a link in the chat to race and ethnicity projections that we did a couple years ago. I think that's probably correct. It might be, I know she had a slide that she used to use where she just did a rough calculation. But I would bet.
That sounds about right from what the projections have been in the past.
Right, and Mallory, that information is reflected in that recent report, 1 and 3, which is correct, Manuel.
I was interested in what you thought, or am I interpreting this right from what you presented? So that without like migration, and in particular Latino migration in recent decades, it looks like the Utah population is near demographic winter or close to non-replacement at this point.
Well, we're definitely below replacement now.
Oh, okay.
Which, yeah, our total fertility rate is 1.985.
That's right.
Came out in the December, January. There was a bit of a freak out.
Right.
Definitely a change in the dynamic that people are used to. Migration has made a big impact on our population growth for the past 30 years and continues to. If you look at other factors like our total population educational attainment and the type of jobs that are coming in, there is a bit of a mismatch sometimes. And so we do need people to come and fill jobs. But yeah, I think it would have been a different looking Utah had we not had that big immigration boom in the 90s, for sure. We wouldn't have had the growth that we've seen.
So when you say 1.9, that is our overall, including Latino. Okay.
Yeah, that's
wow,
the total.
okay.
Yeah.
Is there any state? Are there any states that are above that? Because I have a friend. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I think North Dakota and South Dakota are still above. They're not. They're still around 2, but they're the 2 that are beating us right now.
Okay.
I think one other state. I'll double check right now, but I think we moved down to 4th place. So yeah, it caused some people.
So how many states are above that besides the ones you're mentioning, or is that it?
That's it.
Wow.
Yeah. So I'm looking right now. North Dakota is just a little bit above us at 1.99, and South Dakota is 2.08. So if you're if you're following the demographic beat in the press lately, there are a lot of articles, especially with COVID. Births aren't like rebounding like people seem to think they would. And I'm not a demographer, so I'm coming from just a social science background. So I always think about people, but it's kind of like if our past frame of reference for a bounce back after a bad economic situation was the Depression for World War II. That to me feels like a pretty different context than, 2008, things stabilized, things have a problem again now. There's a lot of factors at play. So
Yeah, and could you speak a little like the freaking out part? Why, sometimes people don't know what the importance of this replacement births and all that. And could you speak a little bit to that?
yeah, so I think the biggest factor that kind of throws people is being able to plan for the future. If you look at other countries, like Japan has been dealing with this for a while. They've had pretty low fertility rates, birth rates, and they don't have the workforce to support the programs needed through taxes and everything for the older population or different programs. There's a dependency ratio, so the number of working age people that can help support kind of the retirement age population and kids. And when those start getting a little condensed, you can have funding problems. I think one thing here, and this is me talking as Mallory Bateman in my kitchen right now instead of as a Gardner Institute representative, is it's been just the standard for this place to have lots of kids. And so I think there's like a bigger just existential crisis people are going through with these lower rates. But yeah, funding programs, having workforce to be able to fill the jobs that we need. But then there's another side where if we have fewer people, maybe we're not using as many of our resources and we can readjust how we look at things. Maria, I just saw your note in the chat. Sorry, I missed it earlier. Asia is different. So there's Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander is one group. And then Asia, the Asian group is a huge group. It includes, China and Japan, but it also includes India and Bangladesh. I can send you the code book because it gets a little confusing, but it's a pretty big chunk of the world that falls under Asia.
Mallory, this is.
Oh, go ahead, Albert. Go ahead, Albert.
I was just going to ask Mallory, when we're dealing with the way people identify, has any studies been made as far as how accurate that is? Because even in the Hispanic group, some people don't know they're white. They mark something down or whatever that may not be quite true.
Yeah, the Census Bureau definitely spent a lot of effort. There was a whole movement throughout the previous decade to try to realign the race question to combine and put Hispanic or Latino in that group, because that's how people identify. They don't go, it's complicated when you've got those boxes to check. One thing the Census Bureau does do, they said, at least for the decennial, is if you put in the race box, you checked some other race and then you put Honduran, they would mark you as Hispanic and probably white in the tabulation of results. So they did do kind of, their data processing includes a step like that. I know that the Biden administration has said they're going to continue research into better ways to make these categories more representative of the population. So I bet we'll see more from the Census Bureau side of research up, in the next couple of years, maybe picking up where they left off before. But yeah, it's a
yeah. Then also during that last census, I kept hearing that they're afraid that possibly illegal immigrants would not open the door to census. They wouldn't fill out the census and mail it in or send it in on the internet or whatever. So
yeah,
I really haven't heard any more from that, whether there really was a decline in people self-declaring.
I haven't seen a ton of work, but the number for, I think, Texas was lower. I think New Mexico and Arizona, their numbers were lower than the estimates projected. And so some outside of the Census Bureau are saying this is a direct reflection of the Hispanic or Latino population not responding, but we don't have the data answer yet. And they do have another survey. They do the post-enumeration survey to have a check to try to figure out who was missed or who was undercounted. And that comes out, those results come out in the fall, I believe. So there might be more insight in the fall.
Yeah, when you're showing the various states, I was looking at New Mexico and Arizona and Texas who border Mexico, yet they were lower than we were.
Yeah. And yeah, I don't know all the reasons for the different rates.
Okay, thank you.
And the other thing with the, so the rate is where we shine, but we added like 500,000 people. Texas added like between 3 and 4 million people. So the rate is different, but people wise, it's a pretty different picture.
Yeah. Mallory, what effect did the pandemic have on the 2020 census? I've heard a lot about that. And did that affect the margin of error, like versus the 2010 census accuracy versus the 2020? What did they say about the pandemic effect?
So the pandemic changed the timeline for collecting data. So they would traditionally end, I think, in July. They were going to end at the end of July because it lined up with the 24th. And I was thinking, I'm going to take a vacation. They extended it out to October. In a lot of our rural counties, they were supposed to get someone dropping a packet off because they don't have traditional mailing addresses. There's more reliance on PO boxes and stuff like that. So that got pushed back to starting that collection in May instead of late March. They did release some operational quality metrics with the apportionment number, and our self-response rate was actually higher this time than in 2010. So they want people to self-respond, because if you have to go through the other methods to respond, the likelihood that the data is representative goes down. So they were glad about that. The proxy, so asking like a neighbor or a landlord or something who lived there, I think the other metrics were all actually pretty close to 2010. So at least from the Census Bureau's vantage point, they're saying it was pretty comparable. In some ways, our metrics were actually better because we got more people to self-respond. But you know, if people were scared and didn't want to respond and never answered the door, and the person that was asked or the administrative record, like the administrative records, they were going to lean on them a bit more. And then it ended up just being to decide if housing units if they were vacant. So that was kind of a partnership with the Postal Service, like their vacancy records. But the initial look makes it seem like it's comparable. Again, when we get that post-enumeration survey in September, that will provide a little bit more detail, I believe, into different segments of the population. But yeah, they had a whole effort around college students because they all left, right? And like tracking these kids down. I'm in that state data center network. Several of the people there have college-aged kids, and they were reporting back to everyone that they'd gotten multiple calls from the Census Bureau because they're just trying to figure out if that student stayed on campus, if they came home, where they were. So that was part of the extension of the data collection process, was also trying to clean up. And that's also why all the data is delayed. If you've seen there's lawsuits from states being upset about the redistricting data coming out later, but it's also to try to make sure everything makes sense in the COVID environment, and make sure all the accounting is done. But they have a whole series of blogs and stuff on the website, getting into more detail than I think they would typically provide, and trying to be pretty open about the data checks they've done. So if that side of it is interesting to you, the blog series is pretty helpful.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? I have one more, I guess, based on just throwing all this rhetoric we hear about anti-immigration and, it seems like the data shows us that if we stop immigration, just flat out stop it, that our economy would probably go to shambles. Correct?
That's what it looks like to me as a non-economist.
Uh-huh. Okay. Because we
Yeah.
don't have enough, we're not producing enough babies here in the United States in order to kind of replace folks in the economy then. And kind of what you're getting at as well with the taxes. And we wouldn't have enough people to pay all the taxes we need to support our schools and whatnot. So, okay, that's kind of what I was thinking as well. Okay. Any other questions, comments?
I have a question, Mallory. Who analyzes this data and how do they effectuate change in the data? More specifically, 1970, we had a 40,000 population. Now we have a 400,000 population. Has the growth in the higher education or technical education, has that seemed to progress at the same expansion of population in those participation in those areas?
I think that's up to people like us at the Gardner Institute or different, Voices for Utah Children or something. Well, they might not look at grown-up educational attainment. There are national analysis that the Census Bureau puts out, and we might get a shout out if we, do really well or do really poorly in one area or another. But I'm gonna suggest for the upcoming research agenda that we do a data book looking at these changes. Pam has wanted to do this for a while, and it's just tricky to try and figure out how we can put it in our agenda. But because I think, we're going to see the numbers from the census showing that the Hispanic or Latino population is our second largest group. If it's 14%, it's still the second largest group. So stay tuned. Hopefully I can provide some more insight. But I would look at Pew for kind of a broader national picture. And I provide a link to their resources in the slides that I'll send to Ed. But yeah, looking at Utah specifically, it's either up to us or, researchers in academia or people that have the time to look at the data. So
Is our middle class getting bigger or less, or is it growing? I know overall that the middle class is stagnated compared to it was 30, 40 years ago. We're getting smaller. How about the Hispanic population? Have they showed increase in better jobs, would mean better opportunities to have not so much wealth, but the ability to participate in higher education or special schooling to build your skill to get these jobs? Have you seen any of that research or any of that work, or do you have a feel how that's going?
not at the state level. I think Pew will have some information nationally, and they might even look regionally, because there's some different characteristics here than there are like in New York. But I would suggest looking at Pew. My colleague Levi Pace has looked at the middle class, but broadly. And I know broadly speaking, like our income distribution in Utah is our high isn't as high and our low isn't as low as other places. We're a little more in the middle. But now my wheels are clicking, and I want to get Levi to help me on on my deeper dive into the Latino population, so we can provide some useful insights. So I'm making a note. But yeah, I would look at Pew, and they can provide some national context. But right now, I don't know of any resources. Ed, you might know of something, but
Well, basically what I've seen is it's increasing, but we're still kind of disproportionately underrepresented or in lower socioeconomic classes and stuff like that. But one of the statistics that you showed, one of the tables you showed with regards to high school graduation rates that are, very much increased, and that bodes well, because that would probably indicate that, we'll see more increases in better jobs and things like that for Latinos and Latinas. So I was pleased to see that, and would probably even increase with regards to professional degrees and all that as well. Okay, anything else? Let's give Mallory a big round of
Thanks
applause.
for your
Thank you so
time.
much. I really enjoyed it, and I'll be looking for the PowerPoint presentation so I can use it in my own class, if that's okay. All right.
Absolutely.
Most of the time, what I do see is national studies and whatnot, and I just haven't had time to kind of look for some of the state data, which I think this would be great to share with my students as well as other people. All right. Thank you so
absolutely.
much. You're
Thank you.
more than welcome to stick around if you want, but if you have other things to do on this bright sunny day, I totally understand. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mallory.